it's as if we've awakened. Instead of the zombie metaphor, maybe the sleeping beauty metaphor, we've awakened after 70 years of sleep, and we are again economic engines for rural America.
Electric cooperatives arose in the 1930s to bring electricity to the rural areas that for-profit companies wouldn't serve. Backed by federal finance, they were the engines of the rural economy. But today they face unique challenges, including a disproportionate reliance on coal-fired power, often purchased on decades-long contracts. And even though rural co-ops serve 90% of counties with persistent poverty, member engagement has declined precipitously from the golden years. Few cooperative members today realize they own and regulate their electric company. This week, Ed Marston, former board member of the Delta-Montrose Electric Association in western Colorado and former publisher of the environmental newspaper High Country News, joins John Farrell to talk about the electric cooperative world. He highlights the good, the bad, and what his and other cooperatives are doing to spur clean energy investment in a region that so desperately needs local economic development. This is Local Energy Rules, a podcast sharing powerful stories about local renewable energy.
You know, we've read about some of the challenges that have faced Delta-Montrose, and Ed, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the closure of the coal mines and some of the other economic threats that have threatened both the community and the rural electric cooperative.
Well, Delta-Montrose Electric Association serves two rural west central Colorado counties, and the economic base had been 1,000 coal mining jobs, underground coal, very high quality coal that was shipped back mainly to the East Coast, to the Tennessee Valley Authority power plants. So we've lost 800 out of 1,000 underground mining jobs. And for a little area, that's yanked the rug out from under us. But it also creates opportunity, because as long as we were kind of a mill town, we couldn't take advantage of other things that in our favor, like our great beauty. We range from the desert to high mountains. We're over the hill from Aspen, Colorado. We have some real advantages, but we were kind of locked down. I went on the board of Delta-Montrose Electric Association in 1983. I got elected through a fluke. I was the first hippie on that board. My 11 fellow farmers and ranchers, rancher directors told me. And it was when I didn't realize it at the time, it was just as the cost curve was changing. Just as it used to be, the bigger the power plant you built, the cheaper the power. And then in the 70s and 80s, that changed, and the bigger the power plant, the more a consumer's power cost went up. And I was part of sort of a consumer revolt against the continual building of coal-fired power plants and the continual raising of rates.
One thing I'm curious about is when you talk about this opportunity that is brought about by some of the economic stresses, what is the rural cooperative able to do? What do you think it can do? And what has Delta-Montrose been able to do, either in your time on the board or since then, to help address some of those economic stresses and the communities that it serves?
Well, my time on the board, I think of the rural electric co-ops as zombies. Think of them as the walking dead. There was that great outburst that you refer to of energy and involvement in the creation of the rural electric co-ops. Then in the 1950s, they were still buying their power wholesale from the investor-owned utilities, from the enemy. And the co-ops banded together and created 65, I think it is, generation and transmission associations, whose job they were a co-op's co-op. Think of co-ops have co-ops the way cats have kittens. There are, God knows, I don't know how many co-ops my board, DMEA, belonged to that carried out different ancillary functions. Anyway, they created these G&Ts, as they're called, Generation and Transmission Associations. They built coal-fired power plants almost exclusively. And they became, from my point of view, a monster that controlled the small retail co-ops, because they had the executive airplanes. They were $1 billion, we were $1 million. So they dominated us, and they dominated us for the purpose. They bought coal mines. They, of course, had huge transmission lines across the rural areas, and we were just their servants, even though in theory we controlled them, because each co-op had one member on the board of the G&T. But in reality, they controlled us, and that's the situation I went into in the 80s, and it has only recently begun to change.
So, when we talk about some of the challenges or opportunities, I guess you could say, for the electric industry, we have, I think you've already addressed one of the issues, and I haven't heard before someone pick as early a date into sort of the reversal of the economies of scale argument about sort of the bigger the better, changing even back in the 1980s. But now, of course, we have solar energy, and we have, in many places, the flattening or even the decrease in energy demand. How has Delta-Montrose responded to that? And then I think I'd love to hear more about what you specifically mentioned about how things are changing in that relationship between the retail cooperatives and the generation and transmission cooperatives that have kind of been the tail wagging the dog, if you will. So
the instrument by which the rural electric co-ops, for the most part, are willing participants in this lord-serf relationship. But the legal instrument by which it is cemented is called a partial requirements power contract. And it's long-term, 20 years, and it requires the retail co-op to buy 95% or more of its electricity from the G&T. So, and each time that contract shortens, the G&T will ask the co-ops to sign on for another 10 years. It's sort of like a Roach Motel contract. You can check in, you can't check out. And we DMEA, for a decade, have been upset with that contract because we are in an area rich in alternative energy. And most people think of solar or they think of wind. We have hundreds of square miles of dying trees. But our big source of alternative energy is our underground coal mines, which emit steady flows of methane, CH4, natural gas. And we're a 100 megawatt utility. We could generate 30 megawatts of that out of the methane emitted by our coal mines. Whether they're open or closed doesn't matter. They continue to exhaust methane to the atmosphere. But we can't, and we also have a lot of water power. We're bounded on the north by the Grand Mesa, which is a 11,000-foot high flat-top mountain. And water falls from it a mile to the valley floor below, lots of water. So we're drowning, and we're very sunny. And as I mentioned, we have the leading instructional outfit for the world, actually, Solar Energy International, based in Paonia, Colorado. So we have all these advantages. We're like a kid in a candy store, but we're on the wrong side of the glass. So DMEA, in an act of astounding bravery, because you have to understand the 800-plus electric co-ops, and there's 65 or whatever G&Ts, are like a family and very tight, and everyone marches in lockstep. And so DMEA last spring went to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and I'll skip the legalities, but basically asked FERC, can we, DMEA, buy alternative power from independent power suppliers in our area? And FERC told DMEA that not only could it, but it had to. If someone approaches DMEA with with electricity generated by renewable resources and at a reasonable price, and we had to buy it. And that freed us from the partial requirements power contract. And that Tri-State, of course, has appealed that, and they will take it to the courts, but it looks like we won.
So, Ed, I was obviously going to come to this because I think it is really one of the most fascinating elements of this reversal of power to some extent, which is the local retail cooperative saying, we don't want to be tied down by our contract with the generation and transmission cooperative, and we want the option to buy local power. So now you have FERC saying you have the authority to do this. You may, in fact, even have a requirement to do this. What's the interest here? Is it a chance now to tap some of these local resources that you talked about, and how extensive is that ability? You mentioned the utility DMEA is a 100 megawatt utility. Could it get all of its power from local sources like the hydro and the methane and the solar, or are there still limits on how much this authority extends?
Well, we could, physically and economically, those are two other things. But in terms of the legal authority, it appears that the FERC ruling allows us to generate 100% locally. And this is frightening, not just to Tri-State, but to all the G&Ts around the country. Because why do they have these partial requirement power contracts? It's because the G&Ts have gone out and borrowed trillions of dollars collectively, billions individually, either from the federal government or in the private bond market. And if it loses its retail co-op customer base, then their bankruptcies loom. And this isn't a win-win necessarily. This is very difficult. And we begged for a decade. We begged Tri-State to sit down with us and work out issues. For example, Tri-State still, I think, carries on its books $80 million worth of investment in a proposed coal-fired power plant in Holcomb, which is really what set DMEA off and made us fight. And they were planning to build, another coal-fired power plant to come online in 2020. And we said we didn't want to be on the hook for that mortgage. And that's what got us going. The fact that they weren't. What we proposed was that the co-ops the retail co-ops be encouraged to generate their own electricity bit by bit and use efficiency and use load management, and gradually, become a different kind of organization. But Tri-State, of course, as a top-down, centralized force, wanted to stay in power. Its executives could not imagine ceding control to the co-ops, both electrical control and political control. The whole structure is top-down.
You walked beautifully into the question I was going to ask then by outlining both the sort of economics and the power issue. It sounds to me as though, within limits, that it was going to be more economical for the local cooperatives to serve their needs for new power, whether it's with efficiency or conservation or some local power generation, rather than building another large-scale power plant. But it seems that though that decision really hinged on this ability or willingness of the generation and transmission cooperative to cede some of its power over its owners, frankly. And it sounds as though even though the economics might have been very smart, that the power relationship has been such that it's been very difficult for the retail cooperatives to be able to exercise that authority.
Right. I think I can't judge all the G&Ts by what I saw at Tri-State, but Tri-State at least ran the co-ops. And if a director, so they would meet once a month, 44 directors in a big room. And if a director got out of line from the G&T's point of view, the lawyers would threaten them, saying they had violated their fiduciary responsibility, and in some cases they sued directors for voting in ways that Tri-State claimed violated their fiduciary responsibility to Tri-State. So it was real bully boy tactics and brass knuckle. My joke is that Tri-State is a law firm with a few power plants attached. But I have lots of sardonic jokes.
So, given this ruling with FERC, and granted there's an appeal pending right now, do you think that Delta-Montrose is going to be able to, and other of the retail cooperatives served by Tri-State, move in this direction? I guess the first question would be, what is Delta-Montrose planning to do? I know you're no longer on the board, but obviously you seem very well connected with what's happening. And do you see other retail cooperatives served by Tri-State also interested in pursuing some more local power generation and more things within their local authority?
So, I can only speculate, but here's my speculation. If Tri-State succeeds so DMEA, as of 2 years ago, had filled its 5% quota. It had installed turbines on a large irrigation ditch, and it was generating 5% of its power.
And just to clarify that when you say it's 5% quota, that is the 5% it was already allowed to do locally under its contract with Tri-State?
Right. And so now DMEA, I understand, has signed a contract which will take it above 5%. And that then you're into the legalities, whether Tri-State will get a restraining order that prevents it from doing this, or whether the FERC rule stays in effect during the coming endless litigation. But my sense is, from having been on the board, that if that gets too messy, the litigation based on FERC's interpretation of the Public Utility Regulatory Power Act of 1978, PURPA, then the DMEA will simply buy out of Tri-State. It will pay off its portion of the mortgage and become a standalone electric cooperative. And in a way, that would be the fair thing to do. And, I can tell you wrinkles, but one wrinkle is that the coal mines were 30% of DMEA's load. So when I say it's a 100-megawatt utility, it's really now heading more for 70 megawatts. And the buyout from the mortgage would depend on how big Tri-State DMEA's load is. So as DMEA declines, it gets cheaper and cheaper to buy out.
So, well, that buyout option is interesting. I mean, do you see other cooperatives first trying to exercise some of that authority within their contracts or within the purview of FERC? I mean, it sounds like DMEA has been really sort of fighting this battle for more than a decade. Are other retail cooperatives in Colorado or in other states served by Tri-State at the same point? Do you see them moving in the same direction, or do you think that they're not quite as far along in that consideration of that relationship? Well,
that's a great question, because there's a co-op that in a way is ahead of us. It's Kit Carson Electric Association based in Taos, New Mexico. And it has completed, I don't know that it's gone through the contract signing, but it has bought itself out of Tri-State. And it's now or soon will be an independent, standalone cooperative. And it was our one ally in the fight over extending the contract by 10 years. Tri-State in 2004 asked all its co-ops to extend their contract by 10 years from 2040 to 2050. And DMEA, reacting to the Holcomb plant, to the Kansas proposal, we refused, and so did Kit Carson, which set off a revolution. But what it means is that we only have 30 years on our mortgage, less 25 years on our mortgage, and all the other co-ops have 10 more years than us. So they're responsible for more of this, what they call stranded assets. I mean, these plants aren't going to keep operating. They're going to turn to junk. and someone is going to have to pay off the mortgage or default. So we were really far-seeing, and what the other co-ops say is, we wish we'd have done that.
This is such an interesting issue in terms of, it much broader than rural electric cooperatives about this issue of stranded assets and investments that utilities have continued to make in large-scale power generation, even as it's become increasingly clear that the economics of, the forecasts for load growth were inaccurate and that the alternatives may end up being significantly cheaper. You mentioned earlier about the cooperatives being asked frequently to extend their contracts as the time came near. And I just want to highlight what you said. I think that's so remarkable. So we're talking about, in terms of the time being near, it was 35 years before the end of the long-term contract for most of these cooperatives between 2004 and 2040. And already Tri-State was coming for a 10-year extension. That makes it pretty hard to plan ahead when you've got such a long mortgage already and are being asked to extend it.
Well, that's the Roach Motel concept. We hired an antitrust attorney to advise us on whether Tri-State was in violation of Sherman antitrust law. And, of course, our lawyers said they were. But that's how we held them off, because they wanted to sue us for not signing. But we threatened them with Sherman. I mean, this is, this is a paradise for someone who's interested in the legalities. But, I mentioned that the cost curve turned, and I don't know, I shouldn't have given a year, I'm not sure, or even a decade, when the cost curve, when bigger became more expensive, because it also had to do with the more and more stringent environmental regulations. But the other cost curve, of course, or two curves that have crossed, are central station power versus distributed generation, or small utility scale generation like solar and wind. And that's what's really killing the G&Ts, because they were wedded to coal. They owned coal mines. They could see coal as far out in the future. They were part of the global climate change deniers back in Washington, D.C. There's a whole red state dynamic that goes on here. The co-ops, I think, cover 75% of America by land mass, but only 12% by population. So, we are red America, to speak politically.
What do you see Delta-Montrose and other electric cooperatives, if they successfully reclaim more of their authority, whether that's through buying out their contracts or other means, what do you see them needing to do to transform their business model in this era of decentralization and more consumer control to be successful in the 21st century?
Well, in a way, it's the same thing that the investor-owned utilities have done, need to do. I mean, Nevada Power has famously, tried to kill solar, strangle it in its crib. But what they need to do is to make their meters. We always talk about meters. We didn't even, and member owners sometimes, but basically around the boardroom with the staff, it was how many meters did we grow. And what all utilities have to do is transform their meters into human beings, into customers who now have, or will soon have, alternatives to central station power. I mean, no utility manager ever got up in the morning and worried that he'd have 50 disconnect calls. Where were you going to go? Well, now you have somewhere to go. So utilities have to court their meters. And so do the rural electric co-ops. And we're in a great position to court our member owners because they do own us. We send them capital credits just like REI sends dividend checks, depending on patronage. And we at least DMEA and Kit Carson, for example, it's as if we've awakened, instead of the zombie metaphor, maybe the Sleeping Beauty metaphor, we've awakened after 70 years of sleep, and we are again we can be economic engines for rural America. For example, DMEA is going to string fiber optic to every home and business in its service territory. And we are now not underserved, we're unserved according to federal standards. And the other thing DMEA is going to do, one way or the other, is to create the investment of perhaps $500 million in power generation. And for us, that's a big amount of money. Those are the hydropower and the coal mine methane and the solar and the biomass that from our dying forests. So I think all of the rural co-ops, lots of co-ops are now suburban. They don't have this potential. But the rural co-ops have this potential to reignite the economies of the rural places they serve.
That was Ed Marston, former board member of the Delta-Montrose Electric Association, talking with John Farrell, ILSR's Director of Energy Democracy. More information on the Delta-Montrose Electric Association's battle with Tri-State can be found in ILSR's new report, Remembering the Electric Cooperative. That report and other local energy rules podcasts can be found on ilsr.org. Until next time, keep your energy local, and thanks for listening.